Welcome to Inside American Politics by Skoob. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're embarking on a challenging but necessary journey, one that will take us deep into the complex landscape of racism in America. This isn't just another surface-level discussion about discrimination. We're going to peel back the layers, examine the machinery, and understand how racism operates as a living, breathing system in our society. Here's what might surprise you right from the start. Racism isn't just about individual bad actors making terrible choices. It's not simply about hate crimes or obvious prejudice, though those certainly exist. Racism, as we'll discover today, is what one professor called a structure, not an event. It's a complex system that operates independently of individual intentions, perpetuating itself through institutions, culture, and power dynamics that many of us never even notice. Today, we're going to dissect this system together. We'll explore what racism truly is versus what many people think it is. We'll understand why the term reverse racism is actually illogical. We'll examine the different types of racism that operate simultaneously in our society, and we'll look at how this system affects not just its obvious victims, but everyone caught within it, including those who benefit from it. This is going to be an uncomfortable conversation for some listeners, but discomfort often signals growth. So buckle up, keep an open mind, and let's begin this critical exploration. Let's start with a fundamental question that most people think they can answer easily. What is racism? If you're thinking it's about prejudice or discrimination based on race, you're partially right, but you're missing the most crucial element. Racism, according to experts who've spent decades studying this phenomenon, is actually about power. Specifically, it's the manifestation of entrenched patterns of power and social control wielded by white individuals to keep people of color in subordinate positions. Think about this for a moment. In the United States, white individuals largely control the government, judicial systems, major corporations, and media. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a statistical reality. This control grants them significant power relative to people of color, and here's the key insight. Racism is what happens when prejudice meets power. Now you might be thinking, but wait, didn't we solve this? We ended segregated schooling, we have affirmative action, we elected a black president, and yes, we've made progress on explicit racist policies. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Racism has evolved. It's become more subtle, more insidious, and in many ways more dangerous because it's harder to identify and combat. Social scientists have been studying this for decades, from Gordon Allport in the 1950s to contemporary researchers today. But here's something fascinating. There's been remarkably little research into how racism affects those who perpetrate it. We focus extensively on victims, as we should, but we rarely examine how this system damages everyone it touches, including those it appears to benefit. This brings us to a crucial distinction that most people don't understand, and it's probably going to challenge some assumptions you have about racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Here's where things get really interesting, and where a lot of well-meaning people get confused about racism. Let me break down three concepts that are related but fundamentally different: prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Prejudice is essentially prejudging someone based on the groups they belong to. It involves preconceived thoughts and feelings, stereotypes and attitudes that we form from limited or misguided experiences, which we then generalize to apply to anyone in that group. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We all have prejudices, every single one of us. It's a universal human trait because we all possess awareness of various social groups, and this awareness is shaped by media, family, educational systems, and religious teachings. Many people claim they don't harbor prejudices, but this usually reflects a fundamental lack of self-awareness. Ironically, our society has taught us so thoroughly that prejudice is bad that we've learned to deny its inevitable presence rather than examine and address it. Discrimination is what happens when we act on these prejudices. It's the behavior, ignoring, excluding, threatening, ridiculing, or even physical violence against others. If prejudice is the thought, discrimination is the action. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Since everyone holds prejudices, Everyone discriminates to some extent. This is why the concept of reverse discrimination is actually illogical. It assumes that discrimination only flows in one direction, when in reality, it flows in all directions. But here's where racism becomes something entirely different and far more systematic. Racism occurs when a racial group's collective prejudice gains strength from systemic authority and institutional power. Let me give you a historical example that illustrates this perfectly: the women's suffrage movement. Individual women could hold biases against men and could discriminate against them in personal interactions. But could women as a group strip men of their civil rights? Could they deny men the right to vote? No, because they lacked the institutional power to do so. Men, however, did have that power because they controlled the societal institutions. Women could only secure the right to vote when men chose to grant it to them. This is the key difference. Racism requires power. An Asian American person might hold prejudices against Latino Americans and might even discriminate against them, but typically lacks the socio-political power to enact systemic racism against them. Neither group holds the institutional power necessary to create and maintain oppressive systems. Now that we understand what racism actually is, let's examine how it operates. Racism isn't monolithic. It's a complex system with multiple components working simultaneously. Psychologist James Jones identified three major types: individual racism, institutional racism, and cultural racism. Individual racism is what most people think of when they hear the word racism: discriminatory beliefs or actions that disadvantage someone based on their race. This includes obvious acts like hate crimes, but also subtler manifestations like automatically locking your car doors when teenagers of a different race walk by. Institutional racism is where things get more complex and more powerful. This occurs when the policies, customs, or frameworks of institutions, government, courts, schools, corporations, law enforcement, systematically advantage the dominant racial group while disadvantaging people of color. Think about racial profiling in policing, or how school funding tied to property taxes perpetuates educational inequalities. Cultural racism might be the most insidious because it's often invisible to those benefiting from it. This involves the dominant group asserting the superiority of its cultural heritage and imposing this perceived superiority on others. It's the assumption that Eurocentric standards and beliefs are universal norms, while other cultural heritages are exotic, primitive, or inferior. But researcher S.P. Harrell expanded this framework even further, identifying four contexts where racism operates: interpersonal, collective, cultural symbolic, and socio-political. In the interpersonal context, racism shows up in day-to-day social exchanges, the microaggressions, the assumptions, the subtle ways racial prejudices influence our behaviors and attitudes toward individuals. The collective context is where we see racism's impact on entire populations: educational achievement gaps, disparities in the criminal justice system, health outcome differences. These aren't accidents or coincidences. They're the predictable results of individual, institutional, and cultural racism working together. In the cultural symbolic context, racism operates through media representations, literature, art, and academic research. People of color are consistently portrayed as inferior, dangerous, lazy, or threatening, while these same cultural vehicles reinforce notions of white superiority and normalcy. Finally, in the socio-political context, racism shapes political debates, public policies, and legislation. The racial narratives that emerge from political discourse don't just reflect attitudes, they actively shape the lived realities of people of color. Let's dive deeper into cultural racism, because it's perhaps the most powerful and least understood aspect of how racism operates. Cultural racism is self-sustaining. It passes from generation to generation, creating and reinforcing a worldview that attributes positive qualities to whiteness and negative characteristics to people of color. This isn't just individual bias. It's embedded in our institutions, our media, our educational systems, our understanding of history, beauty, intelligence, and worth. It creates what we might call a racial reality that shapes how everyone in society sees the world. Here's what makes cultural racism so powerful. It makes whiteness invisible by treating it as normal, standard, universal. When we talk about skin-colored bandages, whose skin color are we referencing? When we describe someone as articulate in a way that suggests surprise, what assumptions are we revealing? When history textbooks minimize or ignore the contributions of people of color while celebrating European achievements, what worldview are we constructing? This creates a fascinating and troubling contradiction at the heart of American culture. We teach that America was founded on democratic ideals of equality, justice, and inclusivity. Yet racism persists as, arguably, an enduring element of American culture. We simultaneously promote democratic values and undemocratic practices, equality and hierarchy, inclusion and exclusion. This contradiction creates what some scholars describe as a schizophrenic society, one that can't reconcile its stated values with its actual practices. And here's a crucial insight. This system victimizes everyone caught within it, including those who appear to benefit. White Americans didn't choose the culture they were born into. As children, they had no choice but to fit within a racial hierarchy that positioned them as dominant. No one inherently wants to be a bigot or racist. These attitudes aren't innate. They're learned through a pervasive socialization process that affects everyone. But, and this is crucial, recognizing that white Americans are also damaged by this system doesn't absolve them of responsibility for challenging it. Understanding how you became trapped in a system is the first step toward freeing yourself from it. Let's talk about what this system actually does to people, not in abstract terms, but in concrete, measurable ways that affect real lives every day. Research consistently shows that perceived racism is linked to negative emotional reactions and psychological distress. For example, studies of elderly African American males reveal that exposure to institutional and collective racism results in significantly increased levels of race-related stress compared to their female counterparts. But it's not just about perception. The environments created by systemic racism have measurable effects on physical and mental health. Racially segregated neighborhoods often feature high crime rates, violence, overcrowding, and limited resources. These conditions adversely impact the psychological functioning of both children and adults living in these communities. For some individuals, internalizing racism leads to behaviors like substance abuse, depression, anxiety, and what researchers term learned helplessness. The constant stress of navigating racist systems literally changes how the body functions, contributing to higher rates of hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, and asthma in communities of color. This is why effective treatment of these issues requires addressing the pathological institutional structures themselves, not just treating individual symptoms. You can't solve a systemic problem with individual solutions alone. Mental health professionals working with African American clients, for example, need to understand and validate their clients' experiences of institutional racism rather than questioning or dismissing them. They need to recognize that responses to racism often represent healthy coping mechanisms rather than pathology. But here's what's particularly important. The impact of racism varies tremendously across individuals and communities. Assuming a one-size-fits-all victimization approach overlooks the incredible diversity, strength, and resilience within communities of color. People aren't just passive victims of racism. They're active agents developing sophisticated strategies for resistance, survival, and success. Here's something that might surprise you. While racism obviously and primarily harms people of color, it also damages white people and white communities in profound ways that are rarely discussed or acknowledged. When white individuals are socialized into a system that positions them as superior based solely on their race, what does this do to their sense of authentic achievement? When they're taught to see themselves as the norm against which everyone else is measured, how does this distort their understanding of diversity and difference? When they're isolated from genuine relationships with people of color due to segregation and stereotypes, what does this cost them in terms of human connection and understanding? Cultural racism creates a false sense of reality for white Americans. It tells them that their achievements are purely individual when they've often benefited from systemic advantages. It tells them that their perspectives are universal when they're actually quite particular. It tells them that their comfort with the status quo is natural when it's actually the result of that status quo working in their favor. This false reality makes it difficult for many white Americans to recognize racism when it occurs, to understand their role in perpetuating it, or to see the benefits of dismantling it. They become defensive when racism is discussed because they experience these conversations as personal attacks rather than systemic analysis. But perhaps most importantly, cultural racism prevents white Americans from developing their full human potential. When you're taught that you're inherently superior to others based on something as arbitrary as skin color, you don't develop genuine confidence, empathy, or resilience. When you're protected from having to understand or navigate other cultural perspectives, you don't develop crucial skills for thriving in a diverse world. The task, then, isn't just about helping people of color overcome the effects of racism, though that's certainly crucial. It's also about helping white Americans recognize how they've been harmed by this system and why they have a stake in changing it. So where do we go from here? How do we address a system that's so embedded in our culture that it often operates invisibly? The first step is what we might call making the invisible visible. As long as whiteness continues to be equated with normality and superiority, it will perpetuate the oppression of people of color. We need to bring the concept of whiteness into the light, to examine it, discuss it, and understand how it operates as a system of power rather than just a racial identity. This means deconstructing whiteness at individual, institutional, and cultural levels. At the individual level, this requires white Americans to develop what researchers call racial literacy, the ability to recognize, understand, and respond to racism in its various forms. It means moving beyond guilt and defensiveness toward genuine curiosity and commitment to change. At the institutional level, it means examining policies and practices that create or perpetuate racial disparities, even when they appear race-neutral on the surface. It means asking hard questions. Why do certain policies produce racially disproportionate outcomes? How do our hiring practices, lending policies, or educational curricula advantage some groups over others? At the cultural level, it means challenging the narratives, representations, and assumptions that position whiteness as normal and superior. It means actively seeking out and amplifying diverse voices, perspectives, and ways of understanding the world. But here's what's crucial. This work can't be done by people of color alone. They've been carrying the burden of addressing racism for centuries, while also dealing with its direct impacts on their lives. White Americans need to take primary responsibility for understanding and dismantling the system that privileges them. This doesn't mean people of color should be excluded from the conversation. Quite the opposite. It means creating genuine partnerships where everyone's expertise and experience is valued, where the burden of education and change is shared more equitably, and where solutions address root causes rather than just symptoms. One of the biggest obstacles to addressing racism effectively is our tendency to focus on individual solutions to systemic problems. We talk about diversity training, bias reduction, and cultural competency, as if racism were primarily about individual attitudes that could be adjusted through education or good intentions. While individual change is certainly necessary, it's not sufficient. Remember, racism is a structure, not just a collection of individual prejudices. Structures require structural solutions. What does this look like in practice? It means examining and changing policies, not just attitudes. It means looking at outcomes, not just intentions. It means understanding that good people can perpetuate harmful systems when they don't understand how those systems operate. For example, in education, it's not enough to train teachers to have positive attitudes towards students of color if the curriculum still centers whiteness, if funding formulas still create resource disparities, if disciplinary policies still disproportionately impact certain groups. Individual bias training is useful, but structural change requires examining and modifying the systems themselves. In healthcare, it's not enough to encourage cultural sensitivity if communities of color still lack access to quality care, if medical research still underrepresents diverse populations, if environmental racism still concentrates toxic exposures in certain neighborhoods. In criminal justice, it's not enough to promote community policing if laws still create racial disparities in sentencing, if poverty still drives people into situations where they're more likely to encounter the justice system, if employment discrimination still limits opportunities for people with criminal records. This is why the work of addressing racism is so complex, and why progress often feels frustratingly slow. We're not just changing minds, we're rebuilding systems that have operated in particular ways for centuries. As we near the end of our journey together today, I want to leave you with both a challenge and an invitation. The challenge is this: you now know that racism operates as a complex system involving individual, institutional, and cultural components. You understand that it's not just about individual prejudice, but about power structures that advantage some groups while disadvantaging others. You can't unknow this information. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? If you're a person of color listening to this, you might be thinking, I already knew most of this from lived experience. If so, I hope this analysis gives you language and frameworks for articulating what you've experienced and observed. I hope it validates your perceptions and provides tools for engaging others in these conversations. If you're white and feeling overwhelmed or defensive, that's a normal response to challenging information. The key is not to let those feelings stop you from engaging further. Remember, recognizing how you've been socialized into a racist system isn't about guilt or shame. It's about liberation. Understanding how systems work is the first step toward changing them. For everyone, regardless of background, here are some concrete steps you can take. First, commit to ongoing education. This conversation we've had today is just the beginning. Read books by diverse authors. Listen to podcasts that center voices of color. Attend workshops and trainings. Follow scholars and activists who are doing this work. Second, examine your own institutions and spheres of influence. What organizations are you part of? What policies do they have? What outcomes do they produce? Where do you have influence to ask questions and suggest changes? Third, engage in uncomfortable conversations. The reason racism persists is partly because it's easier to avoid talking about it. But silence serves the status quo. Practice having these discussions with friends, family, colleagues, not as arguments to win, but as opportunities for mutual learning and growth. Fourth, support the work of people and organizations who are actively addressing racism. This might mean donating money, volunteering time, or using your platform to amplify their voices and messages. Finally, remember that this is long-term work. Racism didn't develop overnight, and it won't be dismantled overnight. But every conversation, every policy change, every individual transformation contributes to the larger project of creating a more just society. We've unpacked a lot today, from the systems behind racism to the human cost it carries. But here's the key takeaway. Racism isn't just about personal bias, it's a structure, and structures can be changed. And yet it's not enough. But the silver lining is that it's not just hopeful, it's powerful. Because if racism is built into systems, then it can be dismantled through systems. Change is possible, not just individually, but collectively. But what happens when the system resists change? When those in power push back? There's more to this story. Real-world examples, hidden histories, and voices that challenge what we think we know. Download the Skoob app now to access the full episode and dive deeper into the forces shaping our world and how we can reshape them together. This has been Inside American Politics by Skoob. Don't forget to download the app and also share the full podcast with others and leave us a review. Together we can continue these crucial conversations and work toward meaningful change.